Fascinating topic. We are all familiar, to some extent, with numerous mitzvahs in the Torah, primarily found in the book of Kedoshim, in the parasha of Kedoshim, which forbid numerous different types of, perhaps a generic term for them would be divination. So there's Shoyel Ba'oiv, who, it's some sort of way of bringing up the dead to communicate with them. There's also the Nachash. A part of today's class we'll be discussing what some of these things mean. And all of these things are forbidden. Magic, in fact, even having a common magician, they're not really magicians, they're tricksters, is questionable. It's customary in the Jewish world to rely on those who are lenient. Specifically, though, I believe Rav Moshe Feinstein was strict that if you have a magician, at a kid's party or whatever, you have to make sure that it's sort of stated explicitly that he's not actually doing magic. It's all sleight of hand and stuff like that. Now, the Rambam places these laws in the section dealing with the laws of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry, because all of these things are forbidden under the umbrella category of other forces other than God. And indeed, the pasuk said, when the Torah tells us not to do things, it concludes with the phrase "Tomim tiya im Hashem alikecha." Now, the word you should be tomim with Hashem your God. Now, the word tomim is perhaps a difficult word to translate. It means complete. It means simple. Rashi translates it in that pasuk as go with Hashem with sort of stay with Hashem with bitmimus, with simplicity, not simplicity as in with genuine. Maybe genuine is a good word. Don't try to figure out the future. Everything that Hashem brings upon you, kabel b'tmimus, accept it wholeheartedly. And this is how you will be together with God and have a portion with God. Now, so let me read to you how the couple of sections of this Rambam, which, as I said, is in the laws of Avodah Zarah, chapter 11, and we are waiting for Ari Marinelli to connect to audio. We welcome Ari Marinelli. Okay. Ein menachashim k'goyim shene'emar lo yisnachshu. The Rambam says you're not allowed to do nachash. Now remember that word. We're going to get to it in the Gemara. You're not allowed to do nachash. What does nachash mean? Nachash. You might have asked, what is nachash? Well, the Rambam himself says, what is nachash? K'goyim. People who say that, I dropped my piece of bread or I dropped my steak, so this is a bad omen. Just mute this.
I have a lot of bad omens. One minute.
This is a bad omen, so therefore I'm not going to go to this place to this place today, because if I will go, my matters will not be accomplished. Or similarly, if a person says, a fox walks past on my right side, so I shouldn't leave my house today, because if I do I'll interact with a dishonest person. Similarly, those who hear the chirpings of the birds and they say this means that such and such will or won't happen, such and such is good or bad to do. Similarly, people who say to shecht a chicken who crowed at the wrong time or stuff like that. And similarly, here's very important. This is the thing. Similarly, somebody who makes himself signs and he says, if such and such will happen to me, I will do such and such, and if it won't happen to me, I won't do such and such. According to the Rambam, that is included in the prohibition of Nachash under the umbrella prohibition of Avodah Zarah. What's an example of such a behavior? Like Eliezer, the servant of Avram. Eliezer, the servant of Avram, came to the well and he said, if I meet the girl and she says, I'll give you to drink, and I ask her to drink, and she says, yes, and I'll also give you your camels, then I'll marry her. Then she'll, right? And if not, says the Rambam, that's forbidden under this Aveira of Nachash. And all other similar things are forbidden, and if you do something because of such a simon, a Nachash, in other words, if you then actually, because the Nachash turned out a certain way, you go and do something proactively, so then you not only have you violated the mitzvah, you actually, it's punishable by the lashes, like you get the 39 lashes. Now it seems quite radical to suggest that the patriarch of the Jewish people, Yitzchak, his shidduch was came to be from such a terrible thing of Nachash, Avodah Zarah. Okay, so right away, the Ravid is the commentary who often disagrees with the Rambam in very sharp terms, and his glosses are printed sort of alongside the Rambam, and he says, absolutely not, and as we'll see soon, he quotes the Gemara, and he says, well, the Rambam's learning the wrong pshat in the Gemara, and we'll see the Gemara soon. Then the Rambam continues, and he says, if somebody says that a certain house that I bought was a simon toiv, it was a good omen, or a woman who I married was a good omen, or an animal that I purchased was blessed, and since I bought this animal, or I guess in modern terms, since I did this investment, I have become successful or rich. And similarly, somebody who asks a child, what are you learning? Which pasuk are you up to in school? And if he says a nice pasuk, something which includes a blessing in it, he will rejoice and say this is a good omen. Says the Rambam, all of this is permissible. Why? Because you haven't done something or refrained from doing something because of it. It's just a personal thing. You feel happy. You feel. I'm just going to plug in the computer here. You feel chizuk, encouraged, because you asked the child which pasuk he's doing, and he randomly chose a pasuk which is a blessing.
How is this different than what we just finished, the 9 days? In the 9 days, there are certain things that we shouldn't do, not because it's a physical issue that it can't be done, but because it's a bad omen. You shouldn't travel on the 9 days and so on.
That's a good question.
Very good.
I don't know.
Get up.
I mean, it could be that the Rambam would disagree with all of that. In other words, there's two aspects to those things. One aspect is Avelos. The reason we don't travel in the 9 days is because you're focusing on the morning for the Beis HaMikdash. It's not, don't get distracted with other things, with other pleasures or whatever. But to the extent that there has been hagim to refrain from certain things because of it's not an opportune time, it could, I don't know, but it could be that the Rambam would not accept that.
9 days was instituted after the Rambam?
No, the Rambam wouldn't. The Rambam doesn't. What do you mean the 9 days? It doesn't say.
You said the Rambam would not agree to this, or would not,
the Rambam
would not necessarily agree to the.
No, he would say that all of the prohibitions of the 9 days are to do with focusing on mourning, not to do with it not being an opportune time. Now, story time. The year is 1948. Actually, it's 1950 already, but it's in consequence in following the events of 1948. When the 35 fallen soldiers of a legendary military convoy were brought for burial at Mount Herzl, following Israel's War of Independence, only 23 could be identified with certainty. To resolve the problem, Rabbi Aryeh Levin performed a little-known Kabbalistic ritual. Now, who was Rabbi Aryeh Levin? So you may be familiar with him. He's known commonly by the book about him, which in English is called a tzaddik in our times. Rabbi Aryeh Levin was a very, very special Jew, and most famously, he's well known for his unprecedented, unparalleled, I should say, almost obsession with helping people. And he went to the most extreme lengths, even putting himself at great danger. There's tremendous, I mean, again, the book, you could read the book, A Tzaddik in Our Times. So he was a phenomenal person. Now, so he, you may be familiar, actually, there's one line of his which was somehow became very, very famous. It's always said at Chasna and Sheva Bracha speeches that when Rabbi Aryeh Levin took his wife to the doctor, and he said to the doctor, "Doctor, my wife's leg hurts us." Not it's hurting her, it's hurting us. Okay. Anyway, so on the night between the 15th and 16th of January 1948, 35 members of a convoy commanded by Danny Mass set out on a mission to deliver supplies to the besieged Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, a cluster of settlements in the West Bank just south of Jerusalem. Before dawn, the unit was discovered and surrounded by thousands of Arab fighters. All 35 members of the convoy were killed in a battle that lasted the entire day. They have come to be known in Hebrew as the Lamed Hey, the 35. After the two letters in Lamed Hey, after the two letters which together indicate the numerical value of the name. Okay. Now, 2 days later, the bodies were discovered by Hamish Dugan, chief of the British police in Hebron. He intended to bring them to burial in Kfar Etzion, but before he could so, Arab residents of the nearby village of Surif mutilated the bodies beyond recognition. This led later to the problem of identifying the dead. And if you look here, there's signs and pictures of the funerals of these 35. Okay, now basically these. So in the English version of this story, which I found online, there are some details missing. But one thing that I read in the Hebrew one is that they were sort of somewhat buried. They were covered. They were buried on the side of the road over there, covered with a thin layer of not a proper burial, but they were, which is okay. A few months after the end of the War of Independence in late '49. The chief rabbi of Israel Defense Forces, Shlomo Goral, who later on became the chief rabbi of Israel, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, initiated a mission to bring the bodies of Gush Etzion's fallen defenders, including the convoy of the 35, for reburial at the National Military Cemetery on Mount Herzl. The bodies had been identified for the temporary burial, like I said, in Kfar Etzion, with great effort, but after the fall of Gush Etzion, the burial details were lost, including the information of who was buried where. As a result, when the bodies were brought for permanent burial at Mount Herzl, it was necessary to re-identify the bodies, and only 23 of them could be determined with certainty. 12 graves remain unidentified. That means they knew who the 12 were, just didn't know which was who. Right? The families of these 12 fallen soldiers approached Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, who suggested that they contact Rabbi Aryeh Levin and ask him to perform a Kabbalistic ceremony known as Goral HaGr, the lottery of the Vilna Gaon, in order to identify the bodies. Now, we'll see later if there's time, but this lottery which he's about to do is known commonly as the Goral HaGr, the lottery of the Gra, but it seems clear that it's not the source of it is not the Vilna Gaon. The source of it, the roots of it, I should say, are much earlier than the Vilna Gaon. Now, I find this detail of the story very interesting because Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank was and is a world-renowned posek. He wasn't a Kabbalist, he wasn't a chassid, he wasn't a mystic. He was a world-renowned posek, and it was Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank who suggested using this method to identify the 12 bodies, and Rabbi Levin. We'll see the details soon. Rabbi Levin was known for his kindness. He was called the rabbi of the prisoners for his habit of writing letters to prisoners and visiting them every Shabbos to visit them in their jail cells to lift up their spirits during the British Mandate period. He was particularly known for his visits to the imprisoned members of the underground movement and those headed for the gallows. He also regularly visited the Hanson Leper Hospital in Jerusalem's Talbiyeh neighborhood to offer encouragement and comfort to the residents. He himself participated in the funeral arrangements and identification of the bodies before the burial of the fallen in Kfar Etzion in 1948. So before that first burial, he was already someone involved. Now, Goral HaGr is a ritual attributed to the Vilna Gaon. Is conducted by randomly opening a Bible and linking the verses onto the page to the matter at hand. The purpose of the ceremony is to find answers to the question of great importance. If there's no hint in the verse, one skips to the next verse and begins with the last letter of the previous verse. Okay, so it doesn't, in the English article and even in the Hebrew article, it doesn't sort of give you all the exact instructions of how to do a Goral HaGr, but in other places we find sort of very clear instructions. There's a certain type of sefer you're supposed to use. Some say it should only be a chumash, some say it should be a sefer which holds the 24 books, and it has to be in a certain print. So you could see here in the picture they're using one which has 2 columns on every page, and you're supposed to put your one finger on one end and spread out the other finger on the other end, and then random open it up and count to 7 pages and 7 verses and 7 words and 7 letters, and it's like a whole, it's kind of it has, for those who are in the know, which is not me, there's kind of very specific instructions of how you're supposed to do it, and there are, it seems, there are different it's sort of passed down by tradition somewhat. So I guess there are, within this very specific instructions, there are differences, and you find different reports of like this. Okay. At first, Rabbi Levin refused to perform the mystical ritual, but after being convinced that it would help the bereaved families gain a measure of closure, he acquiesced. The rabbi was given both a list of the fallen whose burial places were unknown and a sketch of the unidentified graves. There was no need to dig up the graves or desecrate the existing burial sites. He went over the sketch, one grave at a time, and tried to affix a verse to each. According to the book Ish Tzadikaya, which is translated into English called the Tzaddik in our times, the rabbi's work was miraculously swift. At first, a few general verses appeared that contained hints of the letters Lamed Hey. So you actually have, I could show you a picture here. This page over here is the protocol of the meeting, so to speak, handwritten by Rabbi Levin himself. And he says, first he got 11 verses. The first 11 verses that he got were all generic. They weren't about specific soldiers, but they were all very much related to the situation. It said, B'kroi v'yakodesh. That was the first verse he got, that I am sanctified by the Holy One, by these people who were killed to sanctify me. Kodesh Kadoshim Lechaper Aleichem, Holy of Holies, to atone for you. Then a number of verses about going to battle. Again, I'm not going to read all the verses. They got verses which had allusions to Lamed Hey, the 35, which is how this convoy was known, the Lamed Hey, like we said before. And then, after those 11 verses, which were generic, sort of encouraging and speaking about the holiness and all these properties of these fallen soldiers, he had his list of 12 names, and he had the sketch of the grave. So he was like, okay, the first grave we need to identify is whatever it was, row 5, grave number 1. The next one was row 1, grave 6, whatever it is, and it's actually quite unbelievable, quite incredible how exact this whole thing worked. It was Thursday night. They went upstairs to the yeshiva located in the attic of the small modest house of Rabbi Aryeh in Mishkanot Yisrael neighborhood. In the darkened hall, 12 candles were lit, which illuminated the eastern wall, next to which the Torah ark. Those present included Rabbi Aryeh, along with his son-in-law and son. 2 of the parents of the deceased were also in attendance, Mr. Reuven Mas, who was the father of the general who led the convoy, and Mr. Yitzchak Dov HaKohen Persitz. They began with the recitation of Psalms. A sacred silence prevailed. The burning candles added a sense of awe. They opened the Bible randomly without looking for a particular page. After each opening, they leafed through it again 7 times, repeated the act 7 times. Okay. Now I'll read to you. This is it's unbelievable. this. Here you go. So the first soldier, the first pasuk that came up was Omimate Binyamin Begoral, which is a verse in the book of Yehoshua, and one of the soldiers' names was Binyamin. Then they came up a verse in the book of Samuel's, Halo Ben Yamini. Ben Yamini was the family name of one of the soldiers. The next pasuk that came up, Kol HaNefesh Le'Bali Yaakov, and Yaakov was one of the names of the soldiers. Then the next...
There had to be more than one soldier with the name Yaakov.
No.
Really?
Oh, no.
Men?
Actually, there were two, you're right, there were two called Yaakov. How did he decide that was that one? I don't know. The fourth one was Vayom Yosef, and there was one soldier called Yosef. The second one was Va'anak Gaon Yisrael B'fanav, and one of the soldiers' last names was Gaon. Then they had Vayikach Eliyahu Asayalad, one of them was Eliyahu. Ulezulin Omar, one of the soldiers' last name was Zavulani. Then they had Kohen, one of the soldiers' last name was Kohen, Karnach Yevush Tzedek. Oh, there was a third one called Yaakov, but he was called Yaakov Kohen, and they had Nishma Shem Nachim Ato Kohen. Then they had Yisrael, then they had Achash Sha'alti, which was Shaul, that was 11, and then they didn't do the 12th one because that was sort of left, the default was the 12th. And so this was the what they did. And like I said, Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the rabbi, a posek in Yerushalayim, he paskened that this is what they should do, and he allowed them to then write the matzevus on those graves, relying on this Goral that those were indeed the names of those soldiers to be that were buried there. So what are we to make of all of this? And what are we to make of all of this? Now, the truth is, I could tell you a few more stories. We could tell lots of stories for a long time, but it's one of the famous stories of Goral HaGr is with the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim, the author of the Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim relied when I think it was before when the First World War broke out. He wasn't sure what to do with his yeshiva, and he opened up to the pasuk Vayachatz Esa'am L'shtei Machnos, that Yaakov split his camp into two. So this is what he did. Part of the yeshiva stayed where they were, the other half went to Kremenchuk. Now, one thing that's clear, there's other stories of Rabbi Eliyahu, who was in London actually, and he writes that before he used the Goral HaGr to decide whether or not he should move to London. He brings here that there was Rabbi Shimon Shvadron used to use that Rabbi Eliyahu, this is very interesting, would use the Goral HaGr when he had to make the decision of whether or not to expel a student from the yeshiva, which was, he felt, something that he couldn't take responsibility for. Of course, that's always one of the most difficult decisions. Somebody heading a school, you expel a child from the school, you might be ruining him for life, but if keeping him in the school might be ruining everybody else for life. One thing that's clear from all the stories that we see about the Goral HaGr is that those who used them hesitated and only used them very rarely when they felt that they really had to and there was no other choice. It wasn't something that was just used, as they say in Yiddish, every Monday and Thursday for random things. In our Chabad tradition, there's a kind of similar story that when the Alter Rebbe was arrested, so the Chassidim, one of the great Chassidic masters at the time, Rabbi Yitzchak was very close with the Alter Rebbe, and so Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe right away traveled to Rabbi Yitzchak to ask for a bracha for the Alter Rebbe, and he said, what's his name and his mother's name, and somehow the Chassidim didn't know the name of the Rebbe's mother. And so Rabbi Yitzchak opened the Chumash and he said, Ki yesh shever b'Mitzrayim. This is not exactly the Goral HaGr, but also the similar, and it also wasn't to decide what to do, but it's just kind of related, that he said the word shever is shin beis reish, and the Alter Rebbe's name is Shneir ben Rivka. So that's just an interesting story. Now, so let me read you a couple of Gemaras which are of very much relevance. not this one. That's the wrong one. There we go. So a couple of stories from the Gemara. Now, Rav Rav was going to visit the house of his son-in-law Rav Chanan. As he arrived at the riverbank, he saw a ferry coming toward him. Omar, he said that a ferry is coming toward me. It is an omen that there will be a festival in my place of lodging. So in other words, the fact that he happened to be coming to the bus stop as the bus was showing up, so to speak, the ship in this case, was a good omen for Rav. Ozul come above him, so he came across the river. He peered through a crack in the door. He saw animals hanging, slaughtered animals hanging. So he knocked on the gate, and everybody came out to greet him, including the chefs. Now, actually, I should have introduced. This story is in the context of the question of Basar and Alim and Ayin. Rav is very strict about meat that is Nis Alim and Ayin, meat that hasn't been constantly watched by Jewish eyes, and is that the concern that the meat was switched with non-kosher meat. Now, we're not going to get into that the kashrus side of it right now, but just the context. So the chefs came out. So the problem was everybody came out. The meat, those hanging animals, were left unwatched. So Rav didn't remove his eyes from the meat, and he said to the butchers, "If I had relied upon your supervision, you would have fed me forbidden meats to my grandchildren, right? Because you left who knows what happened to the meat." And Rav indeed did not eat from the meat. So the Gemara says, why didn't he eat from the meat? So first it says, well, maybe because he did remove it from his sight. Okay, then the Gemara says maybe he didn't eat, he refrained from eating because he had practiced divination. Rav had said, "Oh, the ship is coming toward me at the time that I'm arriving at the bus at the ferry stop. That's a good omen." So maybe that's why he didn't eat from the meat, because he had done this omen divination thing. It was a bad thing to do. So that's why he didn't eat from the meat. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Now remember, the Rambam said that Eliezer Eved Avram, the way Eliezer found the shidduch Rivka, that was Nachash. And the Rambam is based on this Gemara that Rav says any Nachash that is not like the Nachash of Eliezer, the servant of Avram, or like the Nachash of Yonasan, the son of Shaul, is not considered Nachash. So, now, okay. So what do those words mean, right? So the way Rashi explains the Gemara is that Eliezer Eved Avram, he relied on his Nachash. He said, because, right, if this and this happens, and then he relied on it. He actually gave the girl the jewelry and took her as the shidduch. Similarly, the story of Yonasan ben Shaul, which I'll just say the story quickly, is that he was going with his weapon carrier, whatever, his agent boy. They were going somewhere, and the question was basically, should they retreat or should they attack a certain village? And Yonasan says to him, okay, when we come to the guards, if they say, come up to us, I forget which way it works. If they say, come up to us, 18. He thus decided that he and his armor bearer would approach the guard of the Philistine camp and see the reaction. If they said, halt until we reach you, they would stay there. They would stay where they were and not launch the attack. If, however, they would say, come up to us, they would take it as a good omen and launch the attack. And indeed, that's what happened. He said, come up to us, and he went to launch the attack. So there they made a sign, okay, if this happened, and then they actually did what they said they were going to do. Whereas Rav, he didn't actually do anything or not do anything because of it. He just took it as a good omen. He was happy about it. So clearly it wasn't divination. Okay, so the Gemara says, okay, there was a different reason why he didn't eat from the meat. That's not relevant to us. One moment. So the Rambam understands from this Gemara, right? The Rambam understands from this Gemara that the actions of Eliezer and Yonasan ben Shaul were forbidden, and that's why he gives those examples as being examples of Nachash, which is forbidden. Yes.
Is there any problem with us using this against an enemy?
Against?
The system that of omens, good omens and bad omens,
Against what?
against an enemy.
You can use it. If it's forbidden for any reason.
Okay, because I'm thinking the story of Masada. You know, and to avoid attacks, it said that some snuck down the mountain and put worms or maggots or something inside some of the sheep that they knew that would be checked to see if it was a good omen. Whether they
I was saying to trick the enemy into thing. Yeah, I don't know if that's Anyway, tricking the enemy into doing it, I don't know if that would be considered a problem. You knew they were going to do it, so. All right. Then the Gemara continues. Rav would foretell with a fairy. So Rav, this thing of the fairy, he would foretell with that. The Rashi says that what that means is, one second. Rashi says if there was a ferry waiting for him at the dock, he would take the trip. If you have difficulty getting into the ferry, he wouldn't go on the trip. So again, it seems to be in absolute opposition to the Rambam. Shmuel Badik Wasifra, Shmuel would do it with a scroll. He would open this actually seems to be the closest to the question of the Goral HaGr, because it seems to be saying that he would open a book, a Sefer Torah or something, and based on a pasuk that he would find, right? And just to mention a story that we mentioned on Tisha B'Av, that when Yoshiyahu HaMelech, when they found the Sefer Torah, they opened the Sefer Torah to the curses, and Yoshiyahu HaMelech took that as a very serious sign, and he rendered his garments, etc. Then it says Rabbi Yochanan, and this is perhaps more famous, Rabbi Yochanan would foretell with a verse cited by a child. We saw the Rambam said that he asked the child, which pasuk are you learning? And the Gemara actually tells a story where we see how Rabbi Yochanan relied on a child. What's the story? That all the years during Rav's lifetime, Rabbi Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav was the head of the yeshivas in Bavel. So whenever Rabbi Yochanan would write a letter to Bavel, he would introduce the letter by saying to our teacher in Bavel. When Rav died and Shmuel succeeded Rav, he would write to our colleague in Bavel. He wouldn't write to our teacher in Bavel. Now Shmuel didn't like this. He said, do I not know anything of which I am more proficient than him and can be considered his teacher? It seemed like Shmuel wanted to establish himself so that people should actually give him the respect and the authority that he had as the successor of Rav. So he wrote to Rabbi Yochanan the calendar intercalations, the calculation of the calendar for 60 years to sort of show, look, I can teach you something, you could call me teacher, it's okay. But Rabbi Yochanan was unimpressed, and he said, okay, so he knows he's good at math. Okay. So then Shmuel sent him 13 camel loads of questionable trephos. Now Rashi right away says that 13 camel loads is an exaggeration. It just means he sent him. He basically showed him how there was numerous questions in trephos, in the sort of questions of when an animal is kosher or not kosher, which Shmuel was familiar with. And indeed, he was very impressed with this, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to go to Bavel to meet this man." Before him embarking on a trip, he asked a child, recite me your verse, and the child said the verse, Ushmuel Meis. There is a verse in the book of Shmuel, chapter 20, where the prophet Shmuel dies, and that happens to be the pasuk the child was learning, Shmuel Meis. Now, it's not the prophet, it's different Shmuel. But Rabbi Yochanan took that to mean as a sign that Shmuel had died, and so therefore there was no point in going to Bavel. Now the Gemara continues that actually Shmuel hadn't died, but from heaven they didn't want Rabbi Yochanan to have to exert himself to make this trip to Bavel, so they made him think that Shmuel died, so he wouldn't take the trip. Then the Gemara finishes off with a brisa, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Bayis Tinuk ve'isha. When somebody builds a house, or the birth of a child, or marrying a woman, although there is no divination, there is an omen, which Rashi explains to mean that if, and this was also mirrored in the words of the Rambam, that if you did a successful business deal, a successful marriage, or had a child, the birth of a child, then you could use that, and then you were successful. And the Gemara continues, only if it happened 3 times, then you could consider that as a good omen that to continue those business deals, etc. And the Gemara brings a proof for this from Yaakov, who says, don't take Binyamin down to Egypt. Why? Because this would be the 3rd time I have already lost Yosef when he traveled. I lost Shimon when he traveled. So I'm not gonna. So don't take Binyamin. That's the end of that Gemara. You'll notice a child. So I said a child means that he gave birth to a child and then his business venture was successful. But the Rambam translates the word child in this Gemara as meaning asking a child the pasuk that you just learned. But again, throughout the Rambam's way of understanding this Gemara, the Rambam is very explicit that it's only permissible if you are not doing anything for it. Because of it, you're just taking it as a good omen to feel happy and like, okay, this is a summer, it's encouraging. But any type of action-based, not even action-based, any decision based on this, whether the decision be action or inaction, is absolutely forbidden according to the Rambam. Now, one more Gemara which is very relevant to read. 1 second, before the next Gemara, there is actually this concept of psoikli psukecha, of asking a child what pasuk he learned, is actually a concept which we find numerous stories about and sources for it. One of the famous ones is with Mordechai in the Purim story, that he asked 3 children psukli psukecha, and all 3 of them answered in succession the 3 psukim which we sing after davening: Al tirim pachat pisoim, do not fear, and utzveis of sufar, their plots will be destroyed, and basically that you will be healthy for old age. So, and there's numerous other stories. I just mentioned that one because perhaps it's famous. People may have heard it recounted around Purim time. Now, one more important, relevant Gemara is in. The Gemara I just read to you was from Chulin Tzadik Hey, Chulin 95b, and then there's another important Gemara in Gittin Samachef 68a, where there is a very interesting interaction between Rav Sheshes and the servants of the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa, the exilarch, they call him. He had Rav Sheshes sort of exposed his servants of being less than trustworthy, and the servants wanted to get back at him. So it's a whole long story. I'll just read the relevant part, where it says as follows: when Rav Sheshes was leaving, they dug a pit for him. They threw a reed mat over it, and they said, "Come, master, rest for a while on one of the couches." And since Rav Sheshes was blind, they expected him to fall into the pit, and that would be and then he would die, and that would be their revenge. Now, Rav Chisda snorted to Rav Sheshes from behind him to warn him of the danger he faced. Now, it's obviously not clear in the story why Rav Chisda couldn't do more than that, but the most Rav Chisda was able to do was sort of make a whistle, make some noise, which sort of alerted to Rav Sheshes, be aware something is going on, and of course he's blind, so he has extra attention to these type of things. So what does Rav Sheshes do? He says to a child, "Psoikli psukecha, what pasuk are you happen to be studying?" And he quoted him a verse which comes also from the book of Shmuel 2, which says, "Netei al yamincha el shmalacha," turn to your right or to your left. So Rav Sheshes was like, okay. He asked his attendant, "What do you see?" And the attendant says, "I see a reed mat thrown on the ground." So Rav Sheshes said to him, "Turn away from it." Rav Sheshes had. So then Rav Chisda said to Rav Sheshes, "How did you know to go around the mat?" So he said, "Firstly, because you snorted at me, and second of all, because of the child reciting the verse, and furthermore, I was already suspect of these servants being less than scrupulous, as whatever." There's a whole long story before where he had exposed them as being not very good people. Okay, so again, here we see an example where, from all these examples, there seems to be many cases where we find that the Amiroim did not just rejoice and take it as a good omen, but actually based their actions based on different omens. Here we have him basing his actions on asking the child, and he told him a pasuk, go to the right, to the left. Earlier we had the Rabbi Yochanan not traveling to Bavel because of it, and we also had the story of Rav, who later on the Gemara says he didn't, that he would or would not take a trip based on whether the ship came. And of course we have Eliezer Eved Avram, the examples on the Rambam himself gives of Eliezer Eved Avram, who did the Shidduch for Yitzchak based on that, and Yonasan ben Shaul, who went to attack the Plishti village based on the omen. So, what are we to make of all of this? Now, the Rambam is very clear that all of these things are that doing an action is forbidden. Now, other Rishonim, the primary Rishon who sort of comes to our aid over here is the Ran. The Ran Rabbeinu Nissim, he basically says two things. He says, first of all, when the Gemara says that Eliezer Eved Avram and Yonasan ben Shaul are the sort of stereotypical examples of what Nachash means, the Gemara doesn't mean to say that what they did was forbidden. What the Gemara means to say is that to use those as an example of decision. These people took decision based purely on the Nachash. If she's going to feed the camels, I'm going to ask her to drink. If she's going to feed the camels, I will marry her to Yitzchak, and if not, I won't. And he took action. That taking action solely based on your predetermined sign, that is what Nachash is. However, in order for it to violate the prohibition of Nachash, there has to be an additional element which was missing both from Eliezer and from Yonasan ben Shaul, and that element is arbitrariness. If your sign that you make is completely arbitrary, if the ship happens to be coming to the bus stop when I come there, then you would base your decision purely on that, then that would be Nachash. But in these cases, says the Ran, it wasn't arbitrary. It made a lot of sense. Eliezer wanted to see, he wanted to make sure to find a shidduch with a girl who, as we say in today's language, had good midos. Right? He wanted to make sure he was going to find a kind wife for Yitzchak. So it wasn't a random, arbitrary sign. He was putting her to the test to see, is she a caring, kind person who will go out of her way to take care of somebody? Similarly, he says, with the story of Yonasan ben Shaul, that the sign that he made of if they say come up to us or we go down to you was a reflection of whether or not the guard felt strong and powerful, or were they scared. If they said come up here or something, I forget exactly which way it goes, if they say come up, if they say come up, that means they're scared that you're lying in ambush for us. Now if they're scared, so then that's the teva of the way things work. If the troops are afraid, then they're not going to be successful in battle. So that's why when they said come up to us, that means they were scared there was somebody in ambush there. Yonasan ben Shaul took this as a reassurance that he was safe to attack them. Whereas if they had come down to them, which showed that they were confident in their abilities to overcome any ambush, then he would have known. Right? So that is the worker. That's the way the Ran understands these Gemaras, which is clearly in opposition to the Rambam, but that is a way for us to understand, for example, the story of Eliezer Eved Avram, and the Ravid seems to go along with this also, that all of those were not Nachash. What about the other stories, which Psokli Psokecha tell us a pasuk, or Rav saying the ship? So there the Ran says that you basically have to say that they weren't relying solely on that. It was like, for example, Rav with the ship. He said, if he wanted to go somewhere, he would go even if the ship didn't come as he came to the bus stop. And if he didn't want to go, he wouldn't go even if he happened to be walking past the bus stop and the ship came. But if there was Stadim Lakan and Lakan, there were pros and cons, and he was having trouble to determine what to do. So then he would use that to sort of tip the scale in one direction or the other. Similarly, the story that I read before about Rav Sheshes circumventing the pit with the mat covering it because he asked the child, and the child told him a pasuk of turn right to left. Again, it's explicit in the Gemara that wasn't the only reason, that he had other reasons. First of all, he was anyway suspicious of them, and he heard the warning of Rav Chisda, who made some sort of sound to alert him. So that was just sort of to top off the scale as well. And so so basically, according to those who argue on the Rambam, they would say that first of all, if the nachash is not random and arbitrary, but there's a reason why you're making the simon, then it would be permissible. And similarly, they say that if you're not relying solely on that, but if you're using the nachash, which is random, the ship coming or not coming, that's not sort of, it is arbitrary. But if you're just using that to tip the scale, then according to many of the other Rishonim, it would be permissible. Now, there is, however, a difference between any nachash, for example, the ship coming, and psoik li psukecha. Psoik li psukecha, telling a child that asking a child, which pasuk are you learning now, and taking action based on his pasuk, is seen by some to be not just a sort of a nachash, but to be seen as a nevuah ktana, an element of prophecy. And indeed, this is somewhat based on the Gemara in Bava Basra that says, I believe it's Daf Yud Beis, that says that Yud Beis Yud Gimel, Daf 12 or 13, I'm not sure, that says that when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, prophecy left the Jewish people and it was given to shaita, to imbeciles and to children. Now, not getting into it now, but I will mention that there was some time back a major controversy about a movement to promote and rely on communication of I forget what it was called, facilitated something or other, where they had like autistic kids typing things on computers which sort of foretold the future, and some people wanted to say that we should rely on it based on that Gemara. Now, that's not the same, I'm not getting into that whole thing, but that's not the same as asking a child to recite the pasuk and take action based on that, which we find explicitly stories in the Gemara where the sages did do that. Now, what does it say in Shulchan Aruch? What's the halacha? So, in Shulchan Aruch, in the laws of witchcraft and all this type of stuff, basically it summarizes the Rambams and the Gemaras that we've read until now, and the Ramah says like this: it's permissible to say, to tell a child, it's permissible to tell a child what pasuk are you learning, but the Ramah doesn't say so explicitly. But the Shach says that that the Ramah is implying that it's even permissible to ask a child which pasuk are you learning, and take a decision, an active decision based on that pasuk. And then the Ramah continues and he says that some say that you're allowed to make for yourself a sign, an omen, like Eliyahu and Avraham did, but some say it's forbidden. And the Ramah finishes off by saying that, so this is machlokus, basically, like we saw before. Basically, it's machlokus between the Rambam and the Ran. And the Ramah finishes off, somebody who goes with simplicity and trusting in Hashem, that's the best way to go. You'll be surrounded by kindness. So the Ramah is saying, concerning making simonim, concerning making yourself a sign like Eliyahu and Avraham, so it's a machloikus, is it permissible or not? Best trust in Hashem, Tovim Tiyeh Hashem Elokecha. That's with regards to making a sign, but with regards to psoik li psukecha, to asking a child, which pasuk did you learn? The Ramah, as understood both by the Shach and the Taz, say that it is permissible because it is k'tzas nevuah in the words of the Shach, or nevuah ktana in the words of the Taz. It is somewhat of an element of prophecy. And it seems this idea of sort of getting advice from the Torah, which in the Gemara is called Psoi Kli Psukecha, where you ask a child to say a pasuk, seems to have developed into the idea of opening a chumash or opening a Tanakh and taking advice from the pasuk that way, not by asking a child. Maybe because nowadays children don't learn Tanakh. I don't know, but that seems to be thing. And there is source for this even as far back as the Tanakh teachings in the Sifri. Which talk about taking advice from the Torah. It says David HaMelech, there's a Psikta der of Kana, which is a Tanakh, or at least an Amoraic teaching, which says that David HaMelech would look into the Torah, and it's actually in Kuf Yotes. He says he would look into the Torah and take advice based on that, and we find. So you have from the Chidon, Shiur Brachim, Chaim Shol, a number of references to this idea of opening a chumash and asking and getting advice based on that. And the Chidon actually himself says, because there is another Rambam which is not in the Mishnah Torah but in the response of the Rambam, where he says that. He explicitly forbids this also of opening a chumash to get advice, but the Chida argues that the Rambam there is talking about where somebody is sort of doing this as a public service, where he goes knocking on the doors and sort of presents himself as a fortune teller and says, "Here, I'll open the chumash for you." But he says, if you want to do it to yourself privately, that is okay. And indeed, right. So there are a number of sources which do allow that, and so it seems to be that the Goral HaGr is somehow an extension of this Psoi Kli Psukecha, which was understood by many as being a not Chas V'Shalom and Nachash, but on the contrary of it being some form of Nevuah Ktana of a minor prophecy. And I'll just finish it with two more, with one more point and story, and perhaps a summary. Is like this: in the Sefer Tamim and Hagim, which is a Sefer which is very widely accepted, he says, why is it that in the generations of the Tanoim and Amiram they would ask children Psoi Kli Psukecha? Why didn't they just look in the Sefer themselves? He says the reason is because in those days they didn't have printing, and the Sfarim were written with the sanctity of like a scroll, like we have a Sefer Torah, and therefore they did not want to use and move around those holy scrolls for their own personal needs. And he goes on to quote the idea that you can from the Sifri that you open the Torah to look into what to do. So he says, on the contrary, in a way, the girl, what the Talmud Hagim is suggesting, that this idea of Goral HaGr, he doesn't call it Goral HaGr, but this idea of opening a chumash and getting advice in some way like that is sort of the real way to do it, and the only reason that in the times of the Tanoim and the Amirim they did it by asking a child was because they didn't have printed Chumashim, and they felt it disrespectful to take out the Sefer Torah for their personal needs like that. Then in the footnotes on the Sefer he adds like this. One second. The Mishnah says in the beginning of Pirkei Avos chapter 2, know what is above you. Ayin roya, a watchful eye, v'ozen shemas, a listening ear. V'chol masachem b'sefer nechtamim, all of your deeds are being written down in the book. So he translates this that in the time of the Bayis Rishon, the first Beis Hamikdash, when they wanted to ask Hashem, they had the Urim v'Tumim, they had the Choshen, which how did that work? It would shine up. The letters of the right answer would shine up on the Choshen. So that's Ayin roya. There's a watchful eye. Then in the second Beis Hamikdash, they didn't have that anymore. They had a lesser degree of nevuah, of communication with Hashem, and it came in the form of a baskel, and numerous stories where there was a heavenly voice emanated. That's baskel, that's the listening ear. And then after that, we have a cholma. In the time of Golos, we have kol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtovim. All of your deeds are written in the book, meaning if you open the Chumash, you can find guidance. And he says, this is also the deeper meaning behind another statement later on in chapter 5 of Pirkei Avos, where it says, Hafach ba v'hafach ba d'chula ba, learn more, dig deeper and deeper into the Torah, because everything can be found in the Torah, v'asechzei, and you can see in the Torah everything. But the Baal Shem Tov, he brings it b'shem the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov translated that Mishnah saying that through looking into the Torah you can see the light which Hashem hid at the beginning of creation, which it says there was a light with which you could see from one end of the world to the other. That light can be seen by a tzaddik when looking deeply into the Torah to see from one side of the world to the other. Indeed, there's also other minhagim which are brought that parents would name their children based on opening a chumash and finding whatever, or Tanakh, and naming their children based on a name related to where they opened up in Tanakh. There are indeed numerous stories of miracles of the Talmidei Baal Shem which were based on Psukim. It's almost 10 o'clock, so we do want to finish. I'll just also summarize that the Poskim also point out that in general, using historically we find even explicitly in the Torah use of Goral, of some sort of lottery, to determine things. So, for example, the inheritance in Eretz Yisrael was distributed by a lottery. Yonah was cast off the ship based on lotteries. Also on Yom Kippur, right? The goat that went to Azazel, and the goat was based on lottery. But the boss can point out like this: that if you want to make just stepping back a second from the Goral HaGr, in general, the use of sort of a lottery. So if it's sort of a financial transaction that there's partners, and okay, who's going to get this part, who's going to get that part, and we agree ahead of time that we'll rely on the Goral, that's fine. But he says to use the Goral as any sort of deciding character story, such as in the case of Yonah, or in the case of dividing the land, that can only be done when it's absolutely obvious that there is divine intervention. So he brings from the Midrashim, and even from all the commentaries on Nach, that when it came to Yonah, for example, the reason they relied on it was, first of all, that they made numerous times to draw the lot, and every time it fell on Yonah, and secondly, because it was clearly a miraculous situation where only their ship was in the storm, and they could see in the not too distant area other ships that it was calm, and sort of the storm was directly, so they realized that there was something divine. Similarly, we actually learned this together a few weeks ago, Bob. The Goral that was for the division of the land was also miraculous. Okay, that's basically that finishes the class. The bottom line is the Goral HaGr is something which is condoned by many poskim as being permissible and even an element of Nevuah Ketana, and some want to argue that even the Rambam would allow it if it's done for personal use, not for public. Just for extra credit, I'll finish. There's numerous. I mean, you can find numerous fascinating stories of different Goralis, but one which caught my attention as being having a good lesson is from the Kloisenberger Rebbe. So the Kloisenberger Rebbe was Tzanzer Rebbe. He was a phenomenal Jew. He lost a wife and all his 11 children in the Holocaust. In fact, his oldest son survived, but died in a DP camp, I believe, from typhus a few months after liberation, and he never got to meet him. I think he found out where he was, and they were communicating, but he didn't actually get to. And a tremendous. I mean, you can listen to recordings of him telling some stories, and listen to recordings of his davening. He was a Jew who was, as they say in Yiddish, ataf achecha. He was sort of beyond. Anyway, so he has a story that basically he came into. Somehow he managed to get hold of 4 things of strings to make tzitzis. And he brought them into the DP camp, and he said, "Okay, so who wants tzitzis?" And of course, everybody jumps on them. So they decided, we're going to make a Goral, and we'll choose who gets to. I don't know if it was enough for 4 people, whatever it was enough for a handful of people to get the tzitzis. And well, let's do a Goral. And everybody agreed, let's do a Goral, besides one person. One Bacher came forth. It says his name was Mendel Pshitik. I don't know how to pronounce this. Yeah, and he was a Polish Bacher, and he says, I have first dibs on the tzitzis. He says, what do you mean? Why are you different than everybody else? So as the bacher was standing there, he ripped his shirt in a way that he made that the shirt that he was already wearing had 4 corners. And he says, look, I'm the only person in this room who's wearing a garment with 4 corners. So I currently have a biblical obligation to put tzitzis on my shirt. Everybody else, they don't have they want to make themselves a garment, right? We know there's no, biblically speaking, is a mitzvah. If you have such a garment to put on tzitzis. Nowadays, we always try to go out of our way to do the mitzvah to buy such a garment, to have, right? So he took his shirt, he ripped it, so that he would already be wearing the garment, and that's it. Now everybody else doesn't have an obligation. I have an obligation, you have to give me the tzitzis. So the sons of Rebbe was tremendously impressed with this bacher's passion in the mitzvah, and he said to the bacher, if indeed your intentions are l'shem shamayim, you will win the Goral. And that's indeed what happened, and this bacher was the first of however many people won the Goral. Okay, we'll stop here, and we'll see you all next week in Mitzvah Hashem.